I think a big challenge for psychotherapists is that we have such a proliferation of different therapy brands, different therapy approaches, that I think it becomes confusing and overwhelming for a lot of therapists. You know, which approach to therapy do I choose? Which group do I belong to? And then there's two dangers of that. One is that people become very identified with one approach, but it becomes very limiting. They miss the larger picture. Or else people become dilettantes. You know, they develop a grab bag of different techniques without ever really getting to the underlying psychological principles. They never develop a deep understanding of what the work is about. So somehow we have to get past all of the different brand names and approaches and three-letter acronyms of therapy and get to the root of it. There's a saying in the Japanese martial arts. It says, from one thing, know 10,000 things, which I understand to mean whatever it is that you start with, you need to go deeply into it to get to the foundations. So the Shedler-Westen Assessment Procedure, or SWAP, is a psychological test that's really different from any psychological test that's been developed before. So the intent is to provide a comprehensive description of a patient's personality functioning. And the thing that's different is that it's not a self-report questionnaire that's completed by the patient. It's completed about a patient by an experienced, knowledgeable clinician based on the clinician's in-depth psychological understanding of the person. So it's possible to move beyond the surface of personality traits and get to underlying psychological issues, including unconscious motives, defenses, conflicts, the kinds of things that are really relevant for psychotherapy. So I don't know how much you want me to say about it, but one thing that we're doing with research on the SWAP instrument is developing a diagnostic system for personality that goes beyond just, descriptions of surface characteristics and gets to the underlying psychology. So for example, if you read DSM description of paranoid personality disorder, it basically lists criteria that are different ways of saying that the person is chronically suspicious. There's nothing about the underlying psychological processes. But when we study paranoid personality using the SWAP, what we find is that at the heart of paranoid personality is projection of aggression. So the person is very angry and hostile. They don't experience the hostility internally, they project it or attribute it to someone or something outside of them, and so they experience the world as dangerous and hostile and persecutory. That's one thing that we can do with it. The other thing we can do with it is develop a rich enough psychological description of a person to really guide therapy, to provide a roadmap to how to work effectively with somebody in psychotherapy. Well, I'm a bit of an iconoclast, so what was most gratifying for me was that it was a way of debunking this false narrative that we have in the culture. And the false narrative is that psychoanalytic therapies have somehow been scientifically discredited and that brief, manualized therapies are scientifically proven and superior. And in fact, the research doesn't say that. So I got a certain amount of pleasure out of, telling people the truth about what research really says. The other thing that I got some pleasure out of was the finding that when other forms of therapy are effective, when CBT is effective, it's largely because the therapists are using psychodynamic techniques, whether they recognize them as that or not. A long-standing challenge in psychotherapy research is what researchers have called the dodo bird effect. And for those that are unfamiliar with the term, the dodo bird, it comes from the book Alice in Wonderland. And there was a quotation, they have a race, and the queen says, "Everybody has won and all must receive prizes." So the dodo bird effect in psychotherapy is that whatever form of psychotherapy you study in a research context, it seems equally effective. We haven't been able to show differences between different forms of psychotherapy. Now, to me, that's absurd. I know there's good therapy and bad therapy. I know there's more skilled therapists and less skilled therapists. And yet in research, it's very difficult to show differences. And I think the solution to that, I think the reason there's so much difficulty showing differences between different therapies is that we're using the wrong outcome measures. That by and large, psychotherapy research has focused on symptom improvement as outcome. But as therapists, we're really after much more than symptom improvement. We're not just trying to change the person's symptoms, we're really trying to change something fundamental about the person himself or herself. So I think when we have outcome measures that measure psychological change in a deeper and more meaningful way, I think then we'll have research that's more meaningful. All of them annoy me. Yeah, there's two stereotypes. I don't know if this is this may be more true in the United States than it is in Europe, but there's been a kind of there's been a dumbing down of psychotherapy and what people think of as psychotherapy. So there's a lot of people in the culture who associate it really with, you know, kind of very new agey, kind of new agey, almost magical kinds of things that the therapist is going to. There's an idea that we can bypass the actual work of what it takes to understand somebody psychologically and help them understand themselves, and we're going to substitute some kind of, ill-defined magical healing process. So I think there's a way that people tend to see psychologists as psychotherapists as gurus or shamans, which really isn't what it's supposed to be about. And I said there were two things that bother me. The second is that there's a tendency to substitute being warm and supportive. I'm going to be encouraging. I'm going to be supportive of you, which is a part of therapy, but to substitute that from the real work of understanding somebody in depth in a way that leads to change.